my deep appreciation. I will try not to be too repetitive at this point, but it's hard not to repeat some of these tributes because they're so true and important. So I want to say that I also have felt this amazing, consistent, invaluable resource. Can you hear me? Can you hear me all right? Yes? Yep. Resource in my teaching and in my scholarship on religion and violence against women and children. This topic of working on religion and violence against women and children has been at the center of my vocation for a long time. Let's see, almost 30 years at this point. And Marie Fortune's ideas have been right there at the center of that work for that entire time. I never teach my annual required Christian ethics class to Christian seminarians without mandating some attention to the subject of how church leaders need to respond to domestic and sexual violence. And I never teach it without including a reading from Marie Fortune. Marie, I don't know if you would want to see, in fact, I think you probably wouldn't want to see how the students play you when they are required to do a role play from your perspective as a clergy person responding to a woman who has come to them in their congregation having been victimized by an abusive Christian spouse. But they are required to do it and to use your words and your perspective. But you wouldn't want to see how this in our work on ending gender-based violence in the field of religion, there is one consistent theme that we address over and over and over again, and that's vulnerability. And so I share with Marie the ways in which we have this common interest in offering a critique of how Christian theology, practices, and influence in the broader world and broader discourse of our Christianity-dominated nation can make women and children more vulnerable to intimate violence. I overlap with Marie and appreciate the ways that she has insisted upon an approach, as Sama just said, that demands recognition of that vulnerability because she's crafted her whole approach that starts with the experience of the victim survivor as the primary lens. Her work provides critique, but more than critique. It gives us tools. And specifically in my work, I offer gratitude for the Christian tools that she's provided. My students are hungry for specific tools that talk about specific Christian scripture that mentions forgiveness and divorce and suffering and theodicy, that represent a means of cementing women's vulnerability to intimate violence and abuse, and has cemented that vulnerability in place for centuries. I utilize that media clip of Marie talking about Jesus and divorce and broken covenant over and over again as I train leaders. I also embrace and have benefited from her emphasis on institutional change. And that's where our commitments have overlapped. I have attended a training session with one of my former deans at my seminary on how Christian seminaries, might it be so, possibly, I don't know, could play a role in a church-based movement for ending intimate violence and abuse. Marie Fortune has been my conversation partner, with whom I have agreed and disagreed. I want to mention our disagreements, especially related to the role of race and racism and the experience of domestic and sexual violence for women and girls. For me, part of the invisibility and the silence in the culture and in the church has to do with the ways in which racism contributes to the vulnerability of women of color to intimate violence and abuse. Racial vulnerability is part of the ways in which the vulnerability to violence operates in our broader culture and in the church. And in so many ways, it could be anything from the ways in which, as I have mentioned in my own work, a hotline, rape crisis hotline worker, or a shelter worker can't quite recognize the vulnerability of a Black woman, can't quite hear the crisis as workers. It doesn't, the demeanor, as someone was that I interviewed talked about, the demeanor or the strength in her voice, they just never sound like they're really scared. Or it could be a Black Christian, at least to that hotline worker, right? This sort of, I'm trying to describe the ways in which racial vulnerability operates even embedded in those who are caregivers. Or even a Christian, Black Christian pastor or Black Christian mother or friend might advise, one thing we don't do is we don't call the police. The reason you go back home and you stay with your abuser is in part because the police, they will come and kill. They will come and kill your abuser. And we don't invite our men to be killed. Or the ways in which the definitions need to actually change when we take into account racial vulnerability. When we think about the ways in which trans women of color are targeted for such brutal forms of murder and sexual violence, we can no longer say in our universal statement about violence, intimate violence, well, the place that all women experience violence, we have to say, is with someone they know in an intimate familial relationship. When you have that trans woman of color street violence, that actually isn't the case. So we have to switch the ways in which we're talking. Our concept of domestic violence has to include the ways in which women of color who are domestic workers encounter in domestic settings sexual violence. And so one of the things so we have this sense, at least for me, that intimate violence always occurs in a white racist context. And one of the reasons I mentioned disagreement is Marie Fortune's willingness and deep interest in staying in conversation with me, and the ways in which we were in relationship beyond our disagreement, in the midst of our disagreement, in our dialogue, and entering into dialogue, because this is crucial right now, right? This is crucial. How do you have these conversations across these racial and cultural and religious, I'm talking about among allies. How do we do this collaborative work that is not, we learn from just being sort of guests, like you're the guest who comes in and talks about your community. That's not what I'm talking about, right? And so one of the things that I experienced in my relationship with her, and the reason I'm bringing up this disagreement in part, is the ways in which we have been able to have that notion of conflict as part of how we work, do our work, grow together, learn together, collaborate together. And the connection that you made for me has been crucial with Elizabeth Peterson in South Africa. Again, this kind of transnational collaborative connection. So I offer my gratitude for, we've heard scaffolding, we've heard framework. I'm going to add recipe. The recipe that you have created for transformation that has included being centered on the victim survivor, that is the center, the lens through which we do this work. Emphasis on strategies for religious institutional change, not just the theology and the words and the preaching, actually the practices, institutional change, and crucial, collaborative, solidarity, building, the hard work of actually building, that we are changed by having been in solidarity. And that is the recipe you have created for us to work together to end the violence. I thank you, Marie Fortune.